Shalom everyone and Shavua Tov. Okay, we are just going to make this disclaimer in all of these videos. The disclaimer is this. We are going to be looking at some of the mistakes or misgivings or whatever of the early conception of the state of Israel. We're going to be honest about it and call it for what it is or what it's not, right? It have reputations for being certain things. Maybe they're not, right? We're going to look at it. It's not to make anybody an anti-Zionist or to support anti-Zionism. It's to simply follow in the footsteps of those who went before us, like Yehuda himself. Yehuda, who made a mistake, confessed his mistake, and fixed his mistake. David HaMelech, who made his mistake, confessed his mistake, and fixed his mistake. This is what we're doing. Maybe there's not a mistake to fix. Maybe some of these things were truly accidents and there's nothing more to it. But, okay, especially with the internet being the way that it is, these are documented events. These are things that have happened. There's documentation for them. And so people in the West who are very uneducated in some of these events have no idea that they happened and they can't conceive of it. Like, they just can't, their mind can't wrap around some of these events. And then they lie by omission by saying they didn't happen, and then when met with the documentation or the proof that they happened, that these events happened, they don't know what to do. And I can tell you that I have heard these stories from people who either lived through it themselves or stories that got passed down from the people who lived through it themselves. And it's just a painful thing to talk about. Sometimes it's met with like a vagueness where someone is telling you something but they don't really want to talk about it, or it's met with anger where somebody's telling you something in a very intense way. And so I've heard these stories firsthand from people from the land of Israel, and from the land of Israel is where I actually first heard of these stories. So first, let's talk about what was going on at the time, okay? We're going to be talking today about the Struma event, because somebody mentioned it in the comments of the previous video, the Struma event. And before we talk about what exactly happened on the Struma, what were the events surrounding this boat sinkage? Before the Struma sinking on February 24, 1942, the Zionist movement was actively working towards establishing a Jewish homeland in Palestine, driven by the growing anti-Semitism in Europe and the urgent need to provide refuge for Jews fleeing persecution. This effort was set against the backdrop of the British control over mandatory Palestine following the Balfour Declaration of 1917, which supported a national home for the Jewish people while also promising to protect the rights of the non-Jewish population. By the late 1930s and early 1940s, however, the British had imposed strict immigration quotas through the 1939 White Paper, limiting Jewish entry to Palestine to 75,000 over 5 years, despite the escalating Holocaust in Europe. This policy clashed with the Zionist goals, creating tension between Zionist groups, the British authorities, and the local Arab population, who opposed increased Jewish immigration and land acquisition. What's interesting about this is when you hear these stories being passed down from people, like people who have heard these stories or witnessed it, they paint the Jewish agency in a very bad light. Like, the Jewish agency, to me, has a bad reputation because of hearing these stories. But when you read it like this, it sounds like they were trapped in legality, right? Like, they're trapped in bureaucracy. The same stupid bureaucracy happening today, right? That they're trying to maneuver these bureaucratic measures to get people into the land, but are trying to do so in a legal way, and it's like playing chess. I don't know, but the way that the story is spun when you hear it is that it was the Jewish agency limiting migration. Zionist organizations, including mainstream groups like the Jewish Agency, more militant factions like the revisionist Zionists, were intensifying efforts to bring Jews to Palestine, often through illegal immigration known as Aliyah Bet. The Struma, a dilapidated ship carrying nearly 800 Jewish refugees from Romania, was one such attempt organized by Beitar and the New Zionist Organization in late 1941. At this time, the Zionist movement was not yet a unified state, but a collection of organizations and communities operating under British oversight, building infrastructure like kibbutzim, schools, and the Hebrew University, while facing Arab resistance and British restrictions. The sinking of the Struma, torpedoed by a Soviet submarine after being turned away from Palestine and stranded by Turkish authorities, highlighted the desperate situation of Jewish refugees and the Zionist struggle against British immigration policies, fueling outrage and further radicalizing some Zionist factions in their push for a Jewish state. I think the phrase, the more things change, the more they stay the same, could apply here. I mean, we're basically just reliving this. At the time, people were trying to go to Israel for a bunch of reasons, right? Anti-Semitism, the Nazis. Maybe some people like me, okay, I would do better in Israel than in America. It would be an opportunity for me to build myself up if I went there. And so all these different challenges that people face in desperate times call for desperate measures, right? And as a civilian, you're going to take the best shot for your life, right? And it seems to be the situation. But what was going on with the Struma, right? It says that the Struma got torpedoed. Why was it? Why did it get torpedoed? Was it just a perfect storm? Like, what exactly happened here? What is the Struma and what happened here? The Struma was a small aging ship, a former cattle barrage chartered by the Zionist organization, specifically Batar and the New Zionist Organization, to transfer Jewish refugees fleeing persecution in Europe to Palestine during World War II. Launched from the Romanian port of Constanta on the Black Sea on December 12, 1941, it carried 769 passengers. Some sources cite 791, including crew, mostly Romanian Jews, escaping the Holocaust amid Romania's alignment with Nazi Germany. The ship was overcrowded, unseaworthy, and lacked basic supplies, with a failing engine that barely got it moving. Its journey took it across the Black Sea toward Istanbul, Turkey, where it arrived on December 15, 1941. There it was detained by Turkish authorities due to pressure from Britain, which refused entry to Palestine under its immigration quotas, and Romania, which couldn't take the refugees back. For 2 months, the Struma remained anchored off Istanbul as negotiations failed, with passengers enduring squalid conditions, cramped quarters, little food, and no sanitation. On February 23rd, 1942, Turkish officials towed the powerless ship out to the sea and abandoned it. The next day, February 24, 1942, a Soviet submarine torpedoed the Struma in the Black Sea about 10 miles off the Turkish coast, mistaking it for an enemy vessel. The ship sank rapidly. There was only one survivor, David Stoliar, a 19-year-old Romanian Jew who clung to the wreckage and was rescued by a Turkish fishing boat. All others, men, women, and children, perished, totaling 768 deaths, or 790 depending on the count. The event took place entirely in the Black Sea near Turkish waters, never reaching Palestine. It became a stark symbol of the flight of Jewish refugees and the barriers imposed by international policy at the time. What happened to these people basically was that they were dehumanized by bureaucracy, right? They were at their quotas. They couldn't have any more people coming in. But rather than see them as human beings who were in a severe situation, who literally couldn't return because of a life risk, they're someone else's problem. Just go somewhere else, right? Just go somewhere else. You can't come here. We have our quotas. Go somewhere else. You're not a human being. You are something to be tossed to the side, which ultimately happened to these people, right? The Turkish government ultimately said, they're not Romania's problem, they're not the British's problem, they're not our problem, just tow the boat out to the middle of the sea, right? It's called dehumanization. That's what happened to these people. They were dehumanized. Now, there's all sorts of theories as to why this happened, so let's just look at it, and then I'll tell you who I think is to blame. British deliberate obstruction leading to sinking. Some speculate that the British mandate authorities, by refusing entry to Struma's passengers and pressuring Turkey to expel the ship, effectively set the stage for its destruction. The idea here isn't that Britain deliberately sank the ship, but that their rigid enforcement of the 1939 White Paper's immigration quotas was so uncompromising that it knowingly left the refugees vulnerable to disaster. Turkish collusion or sabotage. Another theory suggests Turkish authorities might have deliberately ensured the Struma's fate by towing it into the Black Sea, knowing it was unseaworthy and at risk. The speculation is that Turkey, balancing neutrality between British and the Axis powers, wanted to wash its hands of the diplomatic mess without openly defying Britain. Some even wonder if the ship was sabotaged to justify sending it out to the sea. Soviet deliberate targeting. While it's established that the Soviet Marine torpedoed the Struma, some question whether it was truly a mistake. An official narrative is that the sub was under orders to sink neutral and enemy ships in the Black Sea to disrupt supplies to Nazi Germany. A conspiracy angle postulates that the Soviets targeted the Struma specifically, perhaps aware of its refugee cargo, as a cold-blooded wartime tactic, or even at Britain's indirect behest to eliminate the problem. A fringe idea occasionally floated that Zionist organizers, particularly the revisionist Betar group behind the voyage, knowingly sent Struma out as a doomed mission to martyr its passengers, hoping to galvanize international support against British policy. This hinges on the ship's appalling condition and the organizers' persistence despite the risk. Historians dismiss this as baseless. The Zionists were desperate to save lives, not sacrifice them, and the high fees paid by passengers show they expected survival, not a publicity stunt. I mean, these people's odds were stacked against them from the beginning, right? They're on a cattle ship that is old and rickety and barely functional, okay? They would have had greater odds taking a old-fashioned paddle boat across the sea, right? So already they're leaving on questionable circumstances. But then the British don't take them. And it's the classic case of bureaucracy dehumanizing people. That, okay, sorry, this cold, heartless, like, sorry, you're not our problem. We met our quota of the number of people we can take in. Go, just stay in Turkey. And then Turkey says, no, we're not taking them. They can't go back to Romania. Romania says, no, they're not coming back here. Okay, so you have this perfect storm of no responsibility on a dehumanizing level, right? Not our problem, which started with the British. If the British hadn't have done it, it wouldn't have happened. But the second the Turkish government put that boat into the sea, their fate was sealed, torpedoed or not, right? Whether an old rickety boat, I mean, people would have just died naturally from these inhumane, harsh conditions that ultimately they chose to get into, right? They chose that risk. But the boat being in the center of the ocean, you know, the second that boat got there, it was going to sink whether or not it got torpedoed. What it does seem to feels when you read about it or you hear about the story that they knew that boat was going to get torpedoed, right? You can just feel it. You know the tensions at the time, you know the mentality at the time, so you just know that this boat didn't have a chance. And the Zionists sacrificing the people is something you hear. When you hear it from Israel, you hear it in a narrative of they didn't want religious Jews coming. They didn't want a religious state. They wanted a communist, anti-God state, so they were sinking ships of religious Jews. And you could say that it sounds completely ridiculous because based on this story that we just heard, you wouldn't get this impression. The problem is, okay, and where it comes from, where this conspiracy stems from, is the fact that there were multiple boat sinkages.